Hey guys, my name is Brittany, and I decided to do my research project on the triangular trade in the Middle Passage. So, to start off with the introduction, the triangular trade is also known as the transatlantic slave trade. It was active between the 16th and 19th centuries, and to simply put, it was a merchandise relationship between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. It was utilized by these countries to expand different ideas to new undiscovered lands. And in short, this trade made these countries a lot of money, but evidently caused long term problems. So, so this diagram shows exactly what was traded and kind of the routes they took to exchange the materials. So the first leg of the trade started with Europe. That's what this orange dotted line is showing. And it shows like where it started. And it says that Europe gave West Africa manufactured goods. They usually exited from ports like Liverpool and London, and the goods they gave to Africa included rum, guns, and clothes. The Africans weren't industrialized at this time, so these seemed like treasures to them. Then the green line shows the trail from Africa to the Americas, and it says that enslaved Africans, this is what is known as the Middle Passage, took place. Africa also contributed to the trade by giving ivory and spices. And then when we get to America, the pink line shows that the Americans gave raw materials to Europe, things like molasses and gunpowder, tobacco, cotton, and wood. They gave those to Europe, and most of these items were mainly for pleasure, not really necessities. But then after those reached Europe, the cycle started all over again. The Middle Passage was by far the hardest thing that I had to learn about during this course. It was a 1 to 6 month journey across the sea on ships, and they took these slaves from West Africa all the way to the West Indies across the Atlantic. Um, this journey happened under very harsh conditions. Their goal was to carry as many slaves on the ship as possible, and it was noted that approximately 12.5 million enslaved Africans were transported on these ships. The middle I wanted to take a step back and kind of talk about what these enslaved Africans went through prior to the Middle Passage. So, one of the hardest realities our ancestors had to face was being captured and sold by their own people. They were chained and had to march for hundreds of miles just to get to the ports where the Europeans would be waiting. And when they arrived, they had to go to what was known as factories, and this was basically the headquarters for slave traders. There, the captives were stripped naked, separated from their families, and expected by people who were described as savages that acted with brutal cruelty. The ships used to carry the slaves were known as slavers. The captains often overcrowded the ships to try and fit as many slaves onto one ship as possible. A ship that was designed for 450 slaves would carry about 600 slaves. The planks on these ships were measured to be 5.5 feet long and 1.3 feet wide and had less than 20 inches of headroom. These planks were stacked above and below decks. It is said that dead bodies have more space in a coffin than the enslaved Africans had on these ships. Immediately after boarding, many slaves would attempt to jump off the ships to avoid being captive. They preferred death. The captains and crew members soon realized what the slaves were doing and attached nets to the sides of the ships in order to stop the slaves from jumping overboard. The, sh- the conditions of the slavers is what the Middle Passage is known for. Diseases were encouraged by the unsanitary conditions. Many slaves caught diseases like malaria, yellow fever, measles, and smallpox. There were also only 4 toilet buckets below the deck. However, most slaves were too sick to make it there. This led to them releasing their bodily fluids on themselves and each other. 10 people had to share one bucket of food and only had a wooden spoon to eat with. So if the spoon dropped, they were forced to eat with their bare hands. This exponentially increased the spread of diseases. It's approximated that one third of the enslaved Africans died on the voyage, and the bodies would remain there for days and possibly weeks until disposed of. The condition Female slaves were subjected to sexual and physical abuse. They were only worth half of what the men were, so they were deemed less valuable. Women and children were less likely to revolt, so the crew members used this as their way in, so to speak. The women and men were kept separated on the ship, so this made them easier for the crew members to access them. Female slaves were subject After the slaves arrived to the West Indies, they went through a disciplinary process that attempted to strip them from their roots. This was known as seasoning. The new slave masters wanted to modify or change the behavior of slaves to make them good laborers. They broke the slaves into different groups. The strongest men did like the heavy field work. Some men and older women did lighter field work, and some became domestic servants. Um, they were assigned European names. They were or Christian names or classic Greece names. They were also taught the European language. There was a criteria required. They had to meet a required criteria to determine if a slave was considered seasoned. One, they needed to survive because many of them died during seasoning. The second criteria was the ability to adapt to the new food and climate. The third criteria was to have successfully learned the language. And the last criteria was to pass the psychological test and did not appear to be suicidal. Ultimately, seasoning did not work because the Africans did not lose their culture. The African beliefs of the supernatural and different methods of coping with life remained constant, along with their dances, folklore, moral values, and etiquettes. The triangular trade in the Middle Passage gave African Americans a taste of how they would be treated in the United States for many centuries to follow. It began with their own people selling them to foreigners. It's very hard for me to grasp the actuality of people believing that they were superior simply because the color of our skin differs. I believe someone truly must be evil to demean another human being. We are all the same and we all bleed the same blood. They were exposed to very harsh conditions and inequalities. So not having a voice in these harsh conditions propelled African Americans to now have a strong voice, and ultimately it made us stronger and to stand up for our equal rights. The triangular trade in the Middle Passage gave African Americans a taste of how they would. I chose to research this topic because it is loosely said that slaves were brought over to America, but after this course, it gave me a lot more insight on how they were actually dragged here. All my life history has never interested me, and like the things we learned about in like prior education, I felt like I never could relate to. The common history books usually just brush over the idea of slavery and never went into depth about the reality of the trauma they faced. The Middle Passage tugged at the strings of my heart, and this is the reason why I chose to research it and learn. I chose to research this topic because it is loose. I chose to research this